Good evening. Thank you for watching our briefing in English. I'm Leah Hogg. Today we meet three authors, all of whom have written books or published books during COVID-19. In 2019, just before the breakout of the pandemic, Timothy Phillips travelled the route of the former Iron Curtain from the Arctic Circle to Azerbaijan and Turkey. In his forthcoming book, he explores the traces of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. We caught up with Dr. Phillips to hear more about his book at the Upper Baraka Gardens in Valletta.
I've written two books before. The first one was about Beslan, which is, as many of you will know, probably a town in the south of Russia where in 2004 a group of armed terrorists took a school hostage on the first day of the school year, and basically the school was destroyed and hundreds of people, many of them children, lost their lives. I wrote a book about that. I travelled there to find out why that conflict had happened, why the terrorists, who were also Russian citizens, had decided to take that school hostage, and also about the aftermath. It was interesting as well to see that, of course, the young children who were in the siege are now adults, because it was 17 years ago now, and one of them actually competed at the Tokyo Olympics last week and won bronze medal.
What a success story.
Amazing story.
What about your second publication?
My second publication took me in a slightly different direction, and in that and the one I'm working on at the moment, I'm looking at the relationship between the old Eastern Bloc, the communist world that before 1991, and the West. And that second book looked at, it's called The Secret Twenties, and it looked at the first Soviet diplomats who came to live in Britain after the Russian Revolution in the 1920s. I got access to the declassified MI5 archives, and I looked at the files on all the people who had come from Soviet Russia and also the British people who helped them or were friendly to them. And I wrote a book about what happened. It led up to an event in 1927 when the British police raided the ambassadorial quarters of the Soviets in the City of London, basically pulled it apart looking for secret stolen documents and expelled all 300 Russians who were living in the UK at the time. There was an interesting Maltese connection, actually.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. You mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so we're standing, I think, in the Upper Baraka Gardens.
Absolutely.
And there's a beautiful modern lift that takes you down to the port. The predecessor of that lift was built in 1903, I think, by a company called McCartney and McElroy, which also ran the tramways here in Malta. So the son of the owner of that company, a man called Wilfred McCartney, he became a very rich man when he was just a teenager in 1916. He inherited the company, but he spent all the money he earned very quickly, all of his inheritance, drinking cocktails in Piccadilly Circus and things like that. He became a jewel thief. He went to prison. And when he came out of prison in 1926 and he didn't know how to make money, he offered his services to the Soviet Union. And he said, I'll steal military secrets for you if you'll pay me. The Soviets were a bit dubious, but British intelligence heard about this and they set him up and entrapped him in the act of giving away secrets. He went to prison for 10 years. When he came out, he wrote a book called Walls Have Mouths, and he fought in the Spanish Civil War. So he was really a very big character.
Yes, absolutely.
And he thought of Malta as his home. Obviously, they had come from Scotland originally, but this was where he lived into the early 1920s. A historian here in Malta has been able to dig out the application he made for a passport here in Valletta in 1920. I think he's 21 years old, but he looks about 50 in the pictures already. And that was before he had been the jewel thief and been to prison twice.
So quite a connection with Malta and espionage there, I think.
Yes, indeed.
What about your forthcoming book? I know you worked on your book during this lockdown, COVID-19, and the inability of us to travel. So you sat and wrote your third book.
Yes, I think some other writers have said this. The pandemic has been terrible in many ways, but actually quite good for writing, because writers often make excuses for not sitting down and actually doing the work. All of those excuses disappeared when we were in lockdown, so I was able to make good progress on the book. What was really strange is that the book is about travel. And in 2019, so just before the pandemic, I was lucky enough to travel from Norway all the way down through Europe to Azerbaijan along the line of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, so the line that used to divide the East from the West. And I interviewed people who had lived there on one side or the other during the Cold War, and I'm just putting the finishing touches to the manuscript at the moment, and then it will need to be edited. But yes, it's called The Curtain and the Wall, so the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall.
When will we see it on the shelves?
Hopefully in 2022, so probably in the autumn of 2022.
Well, I wish you luck with that.
Thank you.
I want to ask your comments. 32 years ago, I believe, Malta hosted the summit here, the Ussr Usa Summit. What are your thoughts over that period and the event happening here on this island?
Yes, a really remarkable event, and often described as the summit where it was agreed between the two superpowers that the Cold War had ended. One of the interesting things about it is it was the very first time at one of those summits that the American president and the leader of the Soviet Union had a joint press conference. And I thought this was interesting because if you remember the recent summit between President Biden and President Putin, they didn't have a joint press conference. So that tells us a little bit about kind of maybe they were closer even in the late 1980s in the Cold War. Gorbachev was in a weak position. And Bush was obviously in some senses in a victorious position. But what's interesting though when you look at the conversations in the summit is that a bit like the weather, which was very turbulent, there were storms and lots of rain, it was the turbulence of world events that were worrying the two men. In a way, the people had gone faster than the politicians in Eastern Europe. And so both of them felt quite considerably out of control. Gorbachev wanted to talk at quite a high principles level, and he wanted to talk about creating a new world order. Bush seems to have wanted to talk more about trade deals and stopping Cuba from meddling in Latin America, so he was more into the detail. It doesn't really feel like a meeting of minds, but perhaps the main thing is that they were talking and they agreed to have the joint press conference.
In your opinion, is it important for Malta to keep its neutrality, and do you see Malta playing a role in world politics in the future?
One of the things I've learned through my research for this book is the potential power of neutrality. Malta obviously wasn't right up against the Iron Curtain, it was a little bit distant. And initially it was locked into the Western system because it was part of Britain, part of the British Empire. The decision to go neutral gave it a different kind of power and potential significance. Places like Austria and Finland, which were also officially neutral during the Cold War, these became the kinds of places where the superpowers could meet and talk in what felt like a safe space. Clearly Malta was part of that. Of course, being neutral may also make you feel protected from some of the risks of being gobbled up by a hostile power. I guess one of the questions I have about neutral countries as we look at the moment with things like climate change and also the growth of Asian powers and the competition for resources, if you aren't part of a bigger grouping, you may struggle in the future to get access to those resources. But of course Malta is in the European